Welcome everyone to the Arts Funders Forum virtual charrette on ethics and equity. I'm Sean McManus, the co-founder of the Arts Funders Forum and co-founder of M+D. We are honored to have with us today two visionary leaders who are reimagining philanthropy for the 21st century. Our first conversation
to the Arts Funders
is
Forum
with Darren Walker
on ethics and equity. I'm Sean.
Our first conversation is with Darren Walker, who, as many of you know, is a passionate and effective advocate for social justice, who leads one of the world's greatest engines of social and economic transformation, the Ford Foundation. And during such a pivotal moment to create real and lasting change in the world, we could not be more grateful to Darren for spending some of his time with us today. As president of the Ford Foundation, Darren steers billions of dollars in financial resources towards finding, developing, and scaling real solutions to social injustices around the world. He has been instrumental in driving the reinvention of centuries-old philanthropic models to inject ethics, equity, and social justice into the system. He is the author of a seminal essay on next-generation philanthropy called The New Gospel of Wealth, which calls for sweeping change to every aspect of the philanthropic sector, which is something he continues to fight for every day. He has made it his mission to convince the world's most influential people to get behind structural change and drive high-impact social and economic reforms across all sectors of society. And Darren is a passionate advocate for the power of the arts and culture to improve societies, uplift communities, and advance social justice and human potential. And as you can see, we have a lot to talk about in 30 minutes. Darren Walker, welcome to the Arts Funders Forum.
Thank you, Sean. I'm really honored for the invitation and to be here with you.
It's a pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us. And I want to mention that my co-host for today's charrette is Melissa Cowley-Wolf, who will be joining the conversation in just a few minutes. And we will be monitoring the chat box on Zoom today, and we'll try to include as many audience questions as possible. So with that, Darren, let's dive in. We're here primarily to talk about the future of cultural philanthropy, which is the big issue that the Arts Funders Forum is focused on solving. But my first question to you today is about how we can all better understand our current moment in history. As someone who has been participating in protests over the murder of George Floyd and others these past weeks, but as someone who has been fighting for social justice for a long time, what are your impressions of the current moment? Is it different this time, Darren? Are we going to see real and lasting change this time?
I hope so, Sean. And I think we won't be able to see lasting change without understanding culture and the arts, because only through the arts, culture, and the humanities can we understand the depth of racism, and can we find the language to understand the pain and the anguish and the grief that we all are feeling as a result of the murder of George Floyd. And so I believe that on this occasion, this time, we have a chance. We have a chance to once and for all move away from the insularity of deniability, because racism has always been able to be denied. After his murder, no one can credibly deny any longer that we do not have a problem of racism in our society. And it's going to be the artists who help us understand how we find our way forward. Yes, the leaders of the very many movements who are on the streets are going to take us to the policy change and the political engagement and the public education that we need. But through the arts, we're going to understand, I think, even deeper how we forge a way forward from what feels like an intractable problem.
Darren, let's dig into the role of the arts as you describe it in cultural transformation and specifically in advancing social justice. In history, the artists have been our activists, have been our advocates for social change. You have been a leader in helping to enable future artists to continue in that tradition. How do you see the arts specifically playing into our current social and political transformation? Part one. And part two, what can arts funders do specifically to accelerate these changes and amplify the role of the arts?
Well, to understand the power of the arts in this moment, you only need to go on social media, because on social media, we are seeing video and media that represents narratives. Artists, documentary filmmakers, and other artists and creatives understand that narrative is what grips the public's imagination, and that visual imagery that represents narrative is how we understand a problem. And so the film, the short films, the video is so powerful. And so we're going to rely on video, documentary filmmakers, and narrative, because we understand that the power of narrative. Artists understand that more. And without artists, there really can be no justice. Imagine the 1960s, the progress we made without Harry Belafonte or Joan Baez or James Baldwin. So many artists and humanists helped us to make sense of what we were experiencing. And today we're seeing a new generation, which is so exciting for me. It gives me so much hope to read Ta-Nehisi's Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones and so many others who are helping us make sense of this moment.
I was relieved to see that Ta-Nehisi in particular was expressing some optimism in the news today about the moment we're in and feeling.
Artists are always optimistic. Artists, even when things are dark, artists help us. They help us see light. This is what artists do, even in our darkest days. Artists bring light into the room. They help us understand that it is possible to not wallow in the depths of our sorrow and anguish and pain, but believe that there can be something better.
Well, Darren, we have been arguing since our founding last year of AFF about the narratives and storytelling that needs to amplify around these points, around the role of the arts. And thank you for expressing that so, so well. And I hope that we can continue to share the stories of the role of the arts in advancing social justice, and you're a part of that process. On that point, we founded AFF last year because we realized, and partly due to our own research and others' research, that younger philanthropists were not engaging with the arts like previous generations, that they were deprioritizing the arts as a general statement. Although driven by social justice, the arts was ranking as the highest priority in philanthropic giving, and we saw the trajectory going in the wrong direction. As a foremost leader in the philanthropic sector, do you see this as syncing up with what you see out there? And if so, how do we begin to solve that problem?
Well, it's certainly true that among a new generation of technology entrepreneurs and philanthropists, there is less interest in the arts. That's a fact. If you were to survey some of the founders of the many unicorns that have gone public in this last 10 to 15 years, you would not find a significant amount of arts patronage among them. I am encouraged, though, because many are interested in issues of social justice, immigration, ending mass incarceration, domestic violence, reform of policing. So they are very deeply interested in social justice issues. I worry that many of them, because they were trained in engineering or in computer science or in fields that do not give them exposure to the arts and humanities, that they leave with a credential that has actually prepared them to be a unicorn, but has not prepared them to be fully engaged in the human experience, and given them the opportunity to experience while in college, while in graduate school, the things that I experienced and that helped me understand as a Black queer man what I was going through. Because the reality of the humanities is, even when you're in your most deepest pain. I mean, I lost my amazing partner of 26 years, and I couldn't talk about it. But there was beautiful poetry and beautiful literature that helped me understand it and talk about it and verbalize what I was paralyzed and unable in my grief to come to grips with. And I just find that too often people who are trained in very technical programs and for those kinds of jobs don't have that experience and aren't given that opportunity. And I think many of them would benefit from it. And therefore, we need to think about our curriculum. We need to think about the incentives that drive students who are learning the sciences away from the humanities, and how actually harmful it is, I believe, for our society.
Darren, what are some examples of things that are happening, whether it's at Ford or at other places, that are helping to move the needle in this regard? Obviously, you raised the issue of education, essentially, and broad-based humanities education and exposure as being one simple solution. Are there other initiatives underway that you'd like to talk about that are helping to advance the mission that we all share together that you've described?
Yeah, well, I do think that we're starting to see the convergence of more art and justice work. I am always happy to talk about my friend Agnes Gund and what she did with her amazing picture, that great Liechtenstein, which was her prized picture that she sold for $165 million. And she took $100 million of that and has focused her efforts on raising awareness and having an impact on the numbers of men and women incarcerated, but also raising awareness in the arts philanthropy community amongst her peers for why they should be supporting and funding efforts to end mass incarceration in America, and doing that by funding programs like poetry, both commissioning poets, commissioning other creatives to write about, to film, to create musical compositions about the idea of incarceration, and then as well funding programs within prisons and jails that help support people who are incarcerated as they prepare for reentry, because that's one of the critical challenges, is that people, as they are reentering communities, are ill prepared to be full participants in their communities. I've also been inspired by what Elizabeth Alexander is doing at the Mellon Foundation, as she is really transforming that foundation from what I always viewed as a quite excellent humanities university focused foundation to one that is truly marching towards justice, working directly with social justice organizations on creative projects. So I am really encouraged, and I'm encouraged because when you look at a place like Sundance, where we have funded many years, And when I was there this past winter, to see the diversity. I mean, when I first went to Sundance 12 years ago as a funder, I was really disappointed in the lack of diversity. And this year, it was palpable, and that's encouraging.
Yeah, Darren, thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Melissa for the next few questions.
Hi, Melissa. You are on mute, I think.
On mute. Is that better?
Much better.
Good. Okay. That wouldn't work too well that way. Thank you again for being here with us today. And for that, and the examples you just gave, especially with the social justice, Art for Social Justice that you founded with Aggie Gund, is such a good model for our community to hear and think about how we can pattern our efforts after that. Darren, the goal of our Remake the Model series that we've been doing is largely for the community of cultural leaders and funders who are here with us to walk away with actionable items to implement. And you've given us a lot of insight and a lot of those calls to action, and we thank you for that. We have several hundred cultural workers and funders invested in advancing arts funding on the call with us today. So I just wanted to go into some specific questions about arts funding and trends that are largely based on what you just were discussing. So Sean had asked you about engaging the next generation, the rising generations in cultural philanthropy. And I want to bring up two articles that you wrote that were incredibly impactful. The most recent one was last weekend in the New York Times, a piece by David Gellis. And your quote was the title of the article called "Corporate America Has Failed Black America." And you assert that current injustices require a systemic response to sufficiently address this crisis that has been decades in the making. This brings me back, and I want to draw us back to a New York Times opinion piece that you wrote in 2019, where you were calling out the boards of institutions. And that article was called "Museums Need to Step into the Future. They reflect the country's widening inequality, and their trustees must help fix this." One of the quotes from that article was that you believe that museums have the responsibility to hold a mirror up to society. As the country becomes younger and more diverse, and as its immigrant population grows, museums must shift. And yet everything that moves an institution forward or holds it back can be traced to the board. So I want to put this in the context of what you were speaking about with Sean and the next generation funding behaviors. Is the next generation and the way that they are approaching philanthropy, can this influence the necessary changes that we need to make to boardrooms across the cultural, philanthropic, and corporate sectors in our country?
Well, I think to the extent that we can speak directly to people who occupy board seats, people who are in positions of influence and power, because make no mistake about this, this is about power. This is about influence and who has it and who doesn't. And traditionally in our country, elites who have occupied the esteemed halls of museums and our symphonies and orchestras and opera halls and other culturals have really defined who we are. And it's why this moment we're experiencing is so challenging. Because from the standpoint of our museums and cultural landscape, that story has pretty consistently been told as a primarily Western European story, or a derivative of that, if you will. And we now, as we listen to that story, it no longer resonates. And I think the challenge for museums and our amazing cultural institutions is that they are charged and have always taken seriously their remit to tell us who we are as a people. And until recently, that was pretty well defined. But it's no longer that straightforward. It's no longer a pretty uniform idea of Western civilization and its antecedents. It's more complex than that. And I think the challenge is that we now need museum leaders to respond in order for museums and other culturals to remain relevant. You won't be relevant if you aren't diverse. You won't be patronized. You won't be supported by your publics, your city councils, your public entities that support museums and culturals. If people don't see themselves in a democracy, representation does matter. And if you believe, as I do, that in our democracy, there is excellence across all sectors. So excellence isn't contained in one community or in one race. It's all of us. There's excellence amongst all of us. But that's not been what has been projected. Excellence has been defined by a set of credentialed, white, primarily male curators and other influencers who have told us, have played the story of who we are. Those stories are no longer who we are. Those stories, in part, are who we are, but the stories are now broader, and we need our museums, particularly in the space that you're talking about, Melissa, as it relates to my writings in the Times. We need these institutions to change.
Thank you. And it brings back to that article. I mean, you get really pointed in the 2019 piece about this and how these, you say, the Candors case, which I'll go back to, at the Whitney, reveals the extent to which museums have become contested spaces in a rapidly changing country. You said on one side of the crossfire are trustees who benefit from this distorted economic system that protects and promotes inequality. And on the other side are people whom the system excludes and exploits. And I think back to the events of 2019, when the cultural community was already involved in debates on ethical philanthropy vis-a-vis these trustees and these institutions. Now we're officially in a recession with our economy. We've reached a boiling point of societal frustrations over issues of inequality and racism. You spoke very brilliantly, of course, about how the system needs to change and move forward. What can the cultural community on the call today take, given these new movements and new moment that we're in, specifically as it relates to the economic moment? How can we look and reassess our boards and redo our boards so they're more representative of our country in a moment of such economic constraint and restriction?
No, Melissa, that's a great question because, for me, the last 7 days or so have felt like 1918, 1929, and 1968 after Dr. King's murder. It all happened in 1 week. And the intensity of it was too much for many people, I think. I think the specific challenge that you raise is the question of what defines trusteeship. For a museum, and again, I've lost track of the number of cultural organizations I've been on the board of. And as I saw as member of the Nominating and Governance Committee or just as board member, membership on the board was increasingly defined by the simple metric of money and capital. And that is the challenge for our boards, because if capital is the only thing we value, and we value it over all else, what kind of board are we going to have of these public institutions? I think that there are many assets a board needs. You do need financial capital. You must have the capacity on your board to give and to give as big as possible. But you also need representation. You need for the board to look like some semblance of the community in which it sits and serves. And that sometimes is a challenge because it's not always possible to find, I can speak for African Americans. I mean, I think for many of us, we are simply overwhelmed by the request to join boards. And that doesn't mean that there aren't many. There are indeed many, many. But the challenge is networks, right? I once had a person in an NNG nominating and governance committee meeting say to me, you know, talking about diversity, and she said, you know, you and Dick Parsons are the only two Black people I know who could be on this board. And you're on the board and Dick is too busy. Now, what I took from that actually was not offense. What I took was her genuinely saying to me, I know we have a challenge, but my network does not include African Americans in any large number. So I can't be helpful the way I could if you were looking for a hedge fund person or whatever. And I appreciated the candor. I appreciated the honesty because it then allows us to say, all right, what is our strategy if we can't depend on most of the normative ways in which we say, okay, look at your network and find a trustee. Well, if your network isn't generating candidates, then we've got to figure out a different way at it.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Sean to get some questions from our audience. They've been pouring in before we conclude with you, Darren. But that was a great note to end that question with. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sean.
Darren, we do have many questions coming in from members of boards of directors of cultural institutions and people deeply involved in the philanthropic sector. And what we are seeing in these questions is a real introspection around structural and systemic change and how to strike a balance. And as someone who I think everyone would agree has done that very well, how do you reconcile blowing up the system with working with it to some extent to drive change? And I think a lot of funders and institutions are asking themselves this question. In the New Gospel of Wealth, you talk about structural reform of the philanthropic sector. I think people are thinking that this entire system needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. You've talked a little bit about some of the ways that we can drive change, but how do you philosophically approach the notion of tearing down a system versus working within it?
So I have been very clear and criticized for not believing that the system needs to be destroyed. So there were people who did not appreciate when some said during the Candor's controversy, we could just burn the Whitney down. It has no relevance for communities of color and people like me in terms of who said that. And I vehemently disagreed because I think the system needs to be redesigned, but we need a system. And we've invested heavily in that system. And many of us, including people of color, have helped build that system. And so we need not to destroy the system. We need to reform the system. And the system needs to be reformed starting at the top, because without change at the very top, and this means that privileged people have to think about what are we going to give, not give back. What are we going to give up? That's a much harder conversation for those of us who are privileged, and those of us who feel like, well, we fund most of this. Why don't people appreciate us? Well, I think for all of us who run institutions that are legacy, I lead a legacy institution that was founded by a brilliant genius engineer and maker of automobiles, who was a remarkable man and also an anti-Semite and a racist. And the Ford Foundation's own evolution as an institution over 80 years, I believe, is an indication of what is possible when an organization takes on the real transformation that it needs to take on. We are still on a journey and far, far from having crossed the finish line or deserving of any applause at Ford. I'm simply saying that it is possible to imagine taking a narrative. And I believe the narrative of most American cultural organizations are rich and profound and are needed today more than ever. But we need to take those narratives and make them relevant for today. And that does mean jettisoning some parts of your history. I thought it was both shocking and satisfying when in 2017, I believe it was, when the Metropolitan Museum finally moved the Native American collection to the American wing of the museum. It's almost shocking to believe that for almost 150 years, the American wing did not include Native American art. But we now see how the American art narrative, the narrative of the history of Native people in this country, is essential to understanding the narrative of American art. And so I do see how big lumbering institutions, even the Grand Old Met, is able to say, wait a minute, we've got to update ourselves in order to actually tell the full story, not to be politically correct, but to actually tell the full story.
Darren, these are inspiring words, and I think a lot of people on this call are hoping to take more direct action than has been taken. And I think your very clear recommendations are going to be a big inspiration for this community. We are basically out of time. We want to thank you so much.
Thank you.
For speaking to us today. Is there any parting message you want to make to individual art funders who have joined the Arts Funders Forum community to try and make change as we say goodbye to you for the afternoon?
Well, thank you, Sean. I'm really, really grateful. And I just want to remind all of us who are lucky enough to be in the work of philanthropy that we are in the business of hope. We're in the business of hope in a time when there is too much hopelessness in our society. We just need to remember, hope is the oxygen of our democracy. And it's our responsibility and our opportunity and privilege as people working in philanthropy and giving resources away to do that with all the energy and gusto that we can. So that's what I'm going to do, and I'm sure everyone on this call are going to as well. Sean, thank you, and Melissa, I'm really grateful for the invitation.
Darren, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, and we hope to be in touch with you on this mission as we forge ahead. And wishing you all the best, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks.
Bye.
Darren.
Fantastic. Okay, we're now going to pivot to our second speaker of the day, David Callahan. See if David Callahan, we'll wait for him to be pulled up here on our screen as I introduce him. David, hi David.
Hey there.
David is the founder and editor of Inside Philanthropy and has written extensively on trends in philanthropy, American culture, business, and public policy. He is the author most recently of what I consider a Bible, The Givers, Wealth, Power, and Philanthropy in a New Gilded Age. Prior to launching Inside Philanthropy, David co-founded a think tank called Demos, which conducts research on inequality and has been publishing extensively about the consequences of the pandemic on racial justice, as well as the current issues around police brutality. In addition to The Givers, he's the author of 7 widely reviewed books on domestic and international issues, including The Cheating Culture, Why More Americans Are Doing Wrong to Get Ahead. We also want to note that Inside Philanthropy has been kind enough to cover the work of the Arts Funders Forum for over a year, and we've been in dialogue with contributing writer Mike Scutari, I hope I'm saying it the right way, who has done an incredible job covering the transformations of cultural philanthropy and higher education, specifically during these very uncertain times. So we're delighted to welcome you, David, to the Arts Funders Forum. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
David, your book, The Givers, is a wide-ranging critique of big philanthropy in our current age. You write about this new Gilded Age, which you say is built by globalization, tech advances, and capitalism, and how it has intensified this unequal distribution of wealth that we see in our society. We've seen a shrinking public sector, and you argue that it is being upstaged by a growing philanthropic sector, where the givers have more power than ever. So you argue that civil society has become less democratic as a result. I was wondering if you could talk with us to start about how you see this specifically playing out in the philanthropic realm and touching upon cultural philanthropy.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. It's always great to be able to talk about my work and the givers. So the way I describe and sort of set the stage in my book is that we've seen a massive accumulation of wealth over the past 30 years or so, starting in the early 1980s. And back in 1982, there were only 13 billionaires in the United States. Now there's over 700, and they have a combined net worth of about $3 trillion. And below them is a very large tier of other extremely wealthy people who are not yet billionaires or quite billionaires, but have plenty of money. And all of that wealth is now, or much of it is now being harnessed for philanthropy. Increasing numbers of wealthy people are turning to giving, and not nearly to the degree that they should, but I think it's a long-term trend that we're going to see more of these people coming in to philanthropy. Meanwhile, at the same time, we're seeing the decline of government and in terms of its capacity, and looking ahead in the years to come, even before the pandemic, federal, state, and local government is facing big fiscal challenges, much of it related to paying for entitlements and pensions for an aging population. So, you have all this private wealth coming into civil society, into philanthropy at the same time that the public sector is pulling back, and that is creating this imbalance that we're beginning to see more and more play out, where the billionaires seem to be in the driver's seat of more and more parts of our society. You look at something like public parks, which should be a classic kind of civic public enterprise, but more and more, the biggest public parks in America are being built by billionaires. Obviously private wealth has long played a role in arts and culture, but that role has become accentuated as government funding for the arts at both the federal and state level has declined, and as more billionaire donors have shown up with big plans. I mean, these are people who are often very ambitious, quite savvy about how to deploy their wealth, and they want to have an impact. And meanwhile, the rest of us, economically kind of running in place, have fewer resources to give to philanthropy. And many people are quite cynical already that the wealthy have too much power in our society. So I think that's all a very dangerous mix, and that it's going to get worse before it gets better.
David, so thank you for that. And I think, that context, especially given your work in global policy, is incredibly relevant and speaks a lot to the structural transformations that we need to address. And, I hope that we can continue to discuss ways that our community can support that activity as well. I did want to dig in a little bit to that point around your work in founding Demos, and it could, because I think it's so relevant to kind of discussing the structural transformations that need to happen. Demos currently describes itself as a dynamic think and do tank that powers the movement for a just, inclusive, and multiracial democracy. How has this work around policy influenced your thinking about how we can evolve the philanthropic sector in particular?
Well, Demos was founded in the late 1990s after a period in which conservative philanthropy had been very effective at building an infrastructure of policy and advocacy organizations that were having a big impact. Classic high leverage example of philanthropy by wealthy individuals and institutions to shape what happens in the public life and in policy. And the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the American Enterprise Institute, powered by donors like the Koch brothers, the Scapes, Olin Foundation, the Bradley Foundation, and Demos. The vision there was, hey, there needs to be stronger organizations committed to equity, stronger think tanks that produce ideas, and advocacy organizations. And I would say that since that time, since we started Demos 20 years ago, there has been a real kind of upsurge, and this is sort of the good news side of the story. There's been a real uptick in more high wealth individuals who are ready to support that kind of work to strengthen our democracy, to create more economic inclusion. And Demos's growth, I mean, it's now a $15 million a year organization, I think is a testament to that. And so, I don't want to be, I don't want to get sort of stuck up on this narrative of billionaires hijacking civil society in ways that only undermine democracy and diminish the voice of ordinary people, because there's lots of examples and more of them of wealthy donors who have very different purposes.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think it's something that we think about a lot and talk about a lot because essentially these large foundations are becoming the multilateral institutions of the future, and that's not irrelevant in terms of driving global policy and shaping the future. So we do understand how relevant this is, and it's something that's part of the overall conversation. Although we are here to talk about arts funding today, and I wanted to sort of bring it back to that and maybe dovetail off of your comments around global policy. How often in your conversations, and we know Inside Philanthropy covers the arts extensively, but in these conversations with foundation owners and high-level philanthropists, what is the vibe, David, around the arts? How are you seeing the arts as playing a role in that overall transformation of foundation-driven power?
It's a mixed picture. If we draw back the lens quite far, what we see, as I said earlier, is diminished public support, public and government support for the arts over the past 30 years, and growing private philanthropy focused on the arts. I tell the story in my book of Eli Broad's outsized role in shaping the arts and cultural scene in Los Angeles, where I live. And that outsized role came about during a period or after a period in which public support for the arts by the state of California was dramatically cut during a period of budgetary downsizing. And I think that same story is playing out in different ways. I would say that, Darren's point about there being the younger generations of donors not being so interested in the arts is certainly true. I mean, we have written about it a lot of Inside Philanthropy. Whenever there's a techie that donates to the arts, it's like a man bites dog story, right? It's like, look at this, a tech guy, actually gave money to the arts. But I don't want to overstate this notion that the new wealth that's emerging in America in the last decade or two ignores the arts, because that's not true. I mean, there's a lot of billionaire donors, many of them older, many of them not in tech, who give quite a bit of money to the arts. I could go down the list. Michael Bloomberg is a great example. He actually did make his money in tech, by the way, and he's been a huge donor to the arts in New York City and beyond. I mentioned Eli Broad. I could give you a lot of other examples, David Geffen, of billionaires who've given for the arts. And there's lots of major donors who give for the arts. Fidelity Charitable in a recent year, their donors moved $250 million to the arts. It was only 6% or something of all Fidelity charitable donations that went out, small amount. But with so much wealth coming into philanthropy, it doesn't need to be that large of a percentage. You don't need that many of these billionaire donors to actually power some pretty high level giving for arts and culture.
David, going off of that, I have this personal obsession. I'd like your feedback on something. Considering what you just said about Broad, Bloomberg, and Geffen in particular, who play these outsized roles. One question I'll get to, which is about, how do we diversify that pool of those big donors within philanthropy at large, but within the arts? The second obsession is this idea of, or the giving pledge, which we know about and you speak about a lot in your book. But is it possible to make a giving pledge for the arts? And in your view, having reported on, interacted with those who participated in the original giving pledge, what's the potential for something like that? And what stories do we need to harness and work do we need to do as a cultural community in order to create something ambitious and of that size that could make a significant impact on our sector?
Yeah. Well, let me just take up the first part of your question about the outsized role of these handful of billionaire donors who tend to be, like most billionaires, white and older men, and they bring their elite priorities to the table in funding the arts. So we wrote a number of articles about the Shed and the fundraising for the Shed in New York City. $500 million raised for a glossy new Manhattan performance space on the West Side in Hudson Yards, which has been called Dubai on the Hudson. It's sort of a playground for wealthy Manhattanites. And we were sort of excoriating at times in writing about this because here we have a city of 8 million people with all these local arts institutions that are underfunded, that are struggling to survive. And like the last priority of philanthropy should be $500 million to an art center on the west side of Manhattan in a rich new neighborhood. But how do you deal? And that sort of story is replayed a lot in different places. And so how do you? One way to deal with that, as you say, would be if you had a pledge for the arts that drew in a larger swath of donors, particularly younger people who are more likely to bring a socially conscious ethos to their arts philanthropy. We've written about this in IP, about how when younger donors do engage in this kind of giving, they're much more likely to be thinking about the arts through an equity lens. They're much more attuned to issues of race and diversity. They're much less likely to get a bunch of money to some predictable kind of elite institution in downtown. And so I don't know exactly how you create that pledge. I do think that the space could benefit from a strong funding intermediary, because if you look around philanthropy, one key trend in recent years has been the growth of more funding intermediaries. You want to help give money to help poor kids, you can give to Blue Meridian. You want to give for global health and development, you can give to Co-Impact, which was funded a couple of years ago. There's a new American journalism funding intermediary called the American Journalism Project. And there's been a number of these, and what those institutions do is they help individual donors who want to give in a sophisticated way. They don't just want to write a check to some name brand institution. They want to give in a way that's sort of sophisticated, and those intermediaries sort of figure things out. So they're the middleman between the donors who want to make a difference and the nonprofits that might be hard for those donors to identify and support. And I think that more than a giving pledge for the arts, that the institution could use a powerful, the arts and culture sector could use that kind of powerful intermediary or a couple of them.
And it's interesting too, how those intermediaries are really now being shaped by what you described as these patterns and giving characteristics from the next generation. And while we've been experiencing a tension between these giving habits of traditional donors and next generation donors, it might be a lot people question, is it going to be these intermediaries that really move the needle on this? Can you talk a little bit more about how we can reconcile and what you're seeing in terms of reconciliation between traditional funding patterns and next generation funding patterns?
It's a kind of hard story to generalize about. I mean, there's so many different things sort of pinging around, and there's a number of traditional foundation, legacy foundations, mainstream donors who do give to intermediaries, and who are increasingly coming together with younger donors. I mean, one positive trend here is we're seeing more partnerships between emerging living donors, many of them younger, and legacy foundations. So great example, Darren Walker is close to Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan, and the Ford Foundation has done some projects with Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, which is the kind of archetypal kind of new philanthropy by a young billionaire donor. And I think that we're seeing more kinds of intersections like that, because both these worlds have something to learn from each other. If you're running the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, you think, well, the Ford Foundation, which has been around for 80 years, probably has a thing or two to teach us about how to do effective philanthropy. If you're the Ford Foundation, you're thinking, boy, it'd really be great to team up with these people who have such deep pockets. Mark Zuckerberg's net worth is 7 times that of the endowment of the Ford Foundation, right? So, and I think that's promising.
Thank you. I'm going to cue Sean here. We wanted to pick up on that thread with regards to the tech industry, which we consider, and you write in your book, kind of the new barons of our age. And a question that we have a lot in cultural philanthropy is how they're largely missing from the picture. The elephant in the room is who's not in the room, as we've said before. So, Sean, do you want to pick up on that thread with David?
Well, David, very simply, it's really a question about how to convert those philanthropists. You mentioned Chan Zuckerberg. Certainly arts is not part of their portfolio currently, I don't believe, although we do understand that there's Silicon Valley foundations that are doing quite a bit of anonymous giving to the arts, which I think is also very interesting. Have you noticed situations where there is effective cross-pollination between different philanthropic sectors and movement or conversion between those as philanthropists, and especially younger philanthropists, kind of grow into their own giving a bit more and begin to think more broadly about their scope?
Well, first of all, let me just say that while the generalization is true that techies don't give a lot to the arts and culture, there are exceptions. Irwin Jacobs, founder of Qualcomm, gave $100 million to the San Diego Symphony, one of the major arts institutions in San Diego. There's other examples. Jerry Yang, the co-founder of Yahoo, made a big donation to an arts institution in San Francisco. There are some examples. What I would say generally about tech donors in the arts is just wait till they grow up. Give it some time, because one of the characteristics of donors to the arts is that in part they're motivated by a kind of place-based civic pride. They believe that the cities where they live should have great cultural institutions, and and not just New York and LA, by the way. I mean, we see major, one of the themes we've written about in our arts, culture, and inside philanthropy is the rise of regional arts philanthropy, that more gifts, like the Denver Museum of Art has raked in a lot of money, or there was a $42 million gift to a museum in Buffalo, right? The Cleveland Orchestra got $12 million. I mean, there's a long list of these sort of regional gifts, and a lot of those come from people who are part of the community and have been for decades. And the thing about these younger tech givers is that they're often very unmoored from where they live. They may just happen to live in Silicon Valley or New York City or Boston, and they haven't been there very long. And they're so when they turn to giving, it's less motivated by that sense of civic pride, and more tends to be motivated by a kind of desire for impact, problem solving, the philosophy of effective altruism, which emphasizes having the biggest bang for the buck in terms of saving lives. very popular among these young givers. Dustin Moskovitz and his wife Carrie Tuna, another co-founder of Facebook, is sort of an exemplifier of that. But my prediction is that these people will evolve over time as they become more rooted in place, as they understand that society involves these key local institutions that need to be developed and nurtured over time.
Right. Melissa, audience questions?
Yeah, we're getting a great number of questions and great questions on the wealth inequalities that we're experiencing and how arts organizations can respond to that, in terms of their programming, in terms of their boards, and in terms of how they are positioning themselves as leaders in this respect. I want to pivot back to what we discussed with Darren and the protests that were happening within the cultural sector in 2019, specifically with the Whitney, the Sackler controversy, and more. We've talked about what constitutes a toxic donor and how that donor and how the way that our systems are structured with regards to trustee leadership, as Darren mentioned, is kind of enforcing what you've referred to as a built-in structural economic problem. And cultural institutions over time became more reliant on these donors. And given our current economic circumstance, IP has highlighted that a lot of organizations, especially the large organizations, have these larger donors, the donors with greater means, to fall back on. And what does that mean for the future of the sector in terms of the resiliency of both larger and smaller organizations? So how can we address this in our current context as these organizations have become more reliant on these donors, and that the majority of people in America have had their incomes just been completely restricted, if not totally eradicated now, as a result of the pandemic and the pandemic-induced recession?
It's a very tough situation and dilemma, and a couple sort of elements to think about here. One is this phenomenon of top-heavy giving that we've talked about quite a bit in Inside Philanthropy. If you look at surveys, data, smaller donors are in decline. There's average Americans give less, volunteer less, and a big reason for that is they have less money because of the inequality of recent decades. That more and more of the wealth has been concentrated at the top. Families that previously might have been philanthropic are now struggling to pay out-of-pocket healthcare costs or college tuition, or all the high housing costs we hear about so often. So you have those small donors that institutions once relied on more heavily than they do now, pulling back. And meanwhile, all these big donors who, Forbes 400 sitting on $3 trillion, just those 400 people who are coming to the forefront more with their philanthropy. And so institutions have increasingly, a lot of different kinds of nonprofits from universities downwards, have sort of restructured their development fundraising efforts to go after the big fish. And so it's sort of a downward spiral, in that the more you pay attention to the big donors, the more the small donors feel like, hey, I'm just, no, my money doesn't count here. I'm not sort of getting any sort of attention or respect within this nonprofit. And so that's one element, top-heavy philanthropy. The second thing is that the toxic donor phenomenon we've heard so much about reflects growing scrutiny overall of the wealthy and of corporations. We haven't talked much about corporate donors yet, but I mean, that's another can of worms, right? You have more and more wealthy people who are coming under scrutiny for how they've made their money. And the goalposts keep changing, right? It's like Warren Kanders, who resigned from the Whitney's board. Nobody ever thought previously that making tear gas was sort of made you a toxic donor, right? And then the conversation changed, and suddenly he's a toxic donor. By the way, he just announced that he's selling his tear gas company. We've seen sort of again and again that happens of as the wealthy come under more scrutiny, we realize that there's more people who've made their money in some pretty unsavory ways. Oh, and by the way, they're the biggest donor to X, Y, and Z cultural institution. But if these organizations kick those donors out, alienate that group, who do they fall back on? Because they don't have the small donors, and there's not the government support. And the pandemic has just made all of these dynamics worse. So I don't see an easy way out of that dilemma. If I was running a cultural institution, I'd be very wary of alienating the wealthy donor class, which is not very repentant. And I mean, it's a mixed bag, but so it's a difficult situation.
David, you bring up, I think, one of the things that's, with your last sentence, that's been on the minds of everyone in this conversation for a very long time. And this conversation is a long time coming. We've been hoping to host a conversation on ethics and equity in philanthropy since our inception. And last year, everything came to a boiling point with the protest that you mentioned, and this idea of the cultural community and artists coming to terms with the toxic donors and board leadership. And the events of 2020, between the pandemic, the recession, and the social protest movements, and this reckoning that we're having, have accelerated all these conversations and made them even more pertinent. So we're really grateful that we've had you here today to give us, as you said, this wider lens on where we are, and to highlight these intersections about wealth inequality, and how they relate to the work that we're doing in philanthropy and as a cultural sector. And we'd love to have you back in the future to dive deeper into these issues. And we're really grateful for your participation. You've given us a lot to think about. So thank you.
I appreciate being included. Thank you.
And Sean, turn it over to you.
David, just to echo Melissa's comments, thank you for joining us to the conversation. We had two intellectual and policy heavyweights who understand so well that change happens both from the top down and the bottom. We heard about structural reform of economic systems and of boardrooms and of systemic change that can happen from the top down from both Darren and David. We also heard about individual actions that we can all take as members of the cultural community to drive change in our own lives and in our own organizations in very iterative ways. And I think we all appreciate that it takes all of that collectively to drive the reforms that we need throughout the US and throughout the world. So what a rewarding and inspirational and timely and relevant conversation. Thank you so much to our speakers, Darren Walker and David Callahan today. Thank you so much. We had hundreds of people from around the world participating and asking questions and watching the charrette today. Thank you all for joining us. Big thanks to the M+D team, Brett Dobbs, Samantha Keel, Kinga Christian, Larissa Schulman, for setting all of this up today. Thanks to Jennifer Joy and her team at Sutton for being our great partners in helping amplify this work and building this community. And we hope that you will continue to tune in to our Remake the Model series, which we will continue on June 24th with our next event, and you'll be receiving information about that very soon. So everyone, thank you so much for joining us. Please send us emails and notes with your feedback and reactions, and we'll continue to work together to drive change. And thank you so much.